Hello everyone, today we talk about one of my favorite topics. I think I've read the Commentarii De Bello Gallico 10 times so far. We already made videos about Celto-Germanic Roman warfare and beyond, so we are no stranger to the topic of Caesar in Gaul. Also, I hope, just out of simple cultural background. Unfortunately, and I will try not to expand much on this because today's topic requires some concentration by itself and it's already demanding as it is. However, on the general, in fact, lack of educational standards by the level that basically the YouTube generation fundamentally just knows that it's propaganda and, that Caesar committed genocide for some reason, the Romans inexplicably conquered dramatically advanced peoples because they threw legionaries at them, and so their fat and proteins diet that couldn't hold that, right? That's Asterix, that's not history. If anything, history is basically the diametrical opposite picture represented in here, at least to most political and strategic and cultural degrees. It's not Caesar's fault if the Gauls did not have a literature. I have Celto-Germanic ancestry myself, and I'm deeply pained whenever I see anyone really buying to what I've really assessed after several years on YouTube talking about military history. The single most persisting myth of some sort, or at least lamentation / whining about how the Celts were taken out by the Romans and the Germans, by the way, because there is also the notion that, for other fantasy notion, by the way, that the Celts and the Germans simply bonded against Rome because they were brothers and whatever. Actually, more often than not, the opposite is true. That is to say, the Celts ended up siding with Rome and actually being fairly content that they weren't taken over by the Germans. Instead, and we have to also understand who we are talking about here politically and socially, because it's not that like living in Central Europe in the 1st century BC was this dreadfully pleasant experience for the average farmer out there that wasn't much of a warrior anymore, for that matter. We talk so much about this, but truly I've never met, I don't know why, right? The greatest opposition to any kind of appreciation of the objective superiority of Roman civilization from this corner fringe that, however, seemed to be an apparently consistent minority that is still apparently in cognitively dissonant denial towards the fact that not just Rome took over Gaul for good in only 8 years as the most advanced Celtic land. We're not talking about Britain, that was basically the least developed and also the least military quality of the entire Celtic world, except some parts of the northeastern fringe somehow. It may be because the Celts did not have their space, they did not have their empire, their overarching monarchy or whatever. They had actually a glorious military history. Before this, the Romans naturally are the major opponent that basically bring that to a painful end. But it's not like the Germans that eventually took over most Roman territories and also basically bonded with Rome, so to the point of being quite eager in adopting her imperial legacy. There were guiles in late antiquity, early Middle Ages that, as the Romans, claimed to descend from Trojan heroes. So even about the Celts, we should be extremely careful in separating from the essentially 19th century fourth estate ethno-narcissistic paranoia about some pseudo, Celticistic anti-Romanism that would have taken place in a general European cultural sense, whereas basically throughout medieval modern history, everybody was basically okay with what Rome did, and there was a general consensus about what had occurred with the Celts to begin with. As I said, again, this is the sad background that I always have to necessarily point out, for the simple fact that it's literally, if you go under I almost take that now as the habitual practice here of any video talking about Rome or the Celts, not just Caesar and Gaul specifically, read the comments, mostly coming from also some systematic dissemination on forums in the 10th of this century about the notion again that if the Celts had united, they would have defeated Rome. Why didn't they do that then? Were they stupid? That's what we should get from that. Or if history went the way it did, why do you think the Celts did not unite? Right? If they could, it would have been such a simple thing. Were they less than the Romans? Were less warlike than the Romans? So there is, like in every conspiracy theory, the opposite and the opposite of the same. Complete alienation from reality, any political, moral, cultural standard, and obviously the notion that the Romans committed genocide, that Caesar was a terrible person. Instead, the Celts were such humanitarian people, as we all well know, like any other people that weren't the Romans, maybe, or that was not associated, again, to 19th century racialistic standards of supposed, in fact, moral superiority. And that basically every time you read Roman literature, not any other literature that ever existed in the world, but specifically Roman literature, it's all wrong. It's all propaganda. It's all the opposite of true. It's basically, you read something in Caesar, it's the opposite of that. Just because Caesar lied, because he was a Roman who conquered the Gauls, and the winners write history. Ask Polybius or Flavius Josephus if that is the case, as a matter of fact. And so I'll be very frank here. One thing is not having had a father in the household. One other thing is not having received first world primary schooling. Another thing is literally not having a culture, being an underdeveloped person. But another thing is, you had your chance at that point to make better, and you could, at least in that moment, shut up, right, and make a better, a better image of yourself, and maybe starting from there to actually give yourself some rudiment in Latin literature and in the, not just, of course, in the Indo-European superiority and Evangelion of Roman civilization, but also, especially also in the enormity of historical objectivity that especially Roman literature produces as the foundation of most of our Western identity, right? You owe to Caesar much more than you understand. Christianly speaking, this is also what the Gospels literally meant. It's not like you have to simply give back to Caesar what is of Caesar's, as if that's something you could do tomorrow. Just say, okay, well, we'll simply follow Christ, and that's it. If you fully did, you would be at least God yourself. The point is that as long as you're on earth, you have to reflect on what Rome has been, what kind of role in the Catholic Evangelion the Romans had in the fulfillment as God-chosen people of the transfiguration of the universe in properly Caesar's theology of the Fortuna Caesaris that I made a video on. How this matches, by the way, the Indo-European tripartite order and the Clausewitz in Trinity. That, again, I'm aware that most people are admittedly, and say not forgivingly, but still understandably not aware of to the slightest, but that's also why I make this many videos. And also, let's be honest, like, if you do not really have a background in Latin literature and Latin language in general, there's not much you can do in terms of historical road. It's a problem. It's a deficit that really impairs most of your, critical thinking, capacity to contextualize, to appreciate properly the essential meaning, the etymologies of. This is just, we speak English here. I try my best to do so, but in general, what we're witnessing with Romanity is what essentially informed world history beyond any other national identity. And this is something that, of course, understood in the Romanitalic sense that I explained also countless times on this channel. The Commentarii De Bello Gallico, as well as the entire Caesar's work, that is also much wider than it's normally credited to, including poetry and that truly saga appreciation of Indo-European skaldic habit of the nobility, and which nobility, in terms of commanding capacities, evidently here is one of the most limpid, properly purest, and most beautiful, also aesthetically beautiful, essentially metaphysically beautiful products of the superiority of Indo-European civilization. Reading Caesar is a way to rekindle properly with some of the deepest roots of military vision in a traditionally religious sense. This is something you can appreciate from Tacitus. You can always appreciate it from different literatures, because everything at the end of the day has the same root. But comparing, for example, Hellenic literature in its already sort of secularizing, rationalizing, and up to a certain point, right, also in that case, style, mindset, and looking at how the Romans wrote, which was also something relatively novel in terms of fully fledged literature that was basically just a couple of 100 years old, in their proper vision of reality and moral forces, it's something life-changing, right? If you're not aware of this, if you've never really read this in original language, nor you have stopped thinking on the meaning of a work like the Commentarii De Bello Gallico, it's a bit difficult to properly understand antiquity and practically everything in that sense. We will naturally come back in many other videos on specific battles, for example, narrated in Caesar's works, that are also just that useful in a strictly military historical sense, but that really contain that truly communal Roman vision and approach to warfare that Caesar masterfully delivered in an instrumental way, of course, especially for not just the commoners, but of course a certain part of Roman establishment to also, and this is the other story, that basically the Romans would have hidden, right, a dramatic development of a Celtic civilization that they destroyed, annihilated. I don't know how to tell you, but the Gauls went on under Rome to become one of the most successful people in the history of mankind. And especially Caesar was, especially because of his political aim, if you're really searching for propaganda, that in itself, we are fully aware of, we can't simply districate ourselves through, and that was incredibly brilliant, intelligent, and effective in, of course, showing the Gauls actually as ready for Romanization, and so displaying certain qualities that, of course, were positive in nature, were showing the Romans that these were not simple barbarians, and that they could be integrated through the extension of citizenship, also for reasons that we know, say, in Caesar's policy, history, and background that we're not going to repeat here. And that is also actually true, by the way. So whatever embellishment you think that Caesar may have done, whichever number, cipher you think he may have thrown here or not, it's never random. There's always a very specific reason that is not, okay, let's show that the Romans won 1-10 against the Celts. It's actually to tell something very specific from a political, strategical, and moral point of view in the work, right? And that only an illiterate person is not able to understand. Also because the work is very understandable, is very clear, is very straightforward. So much so, in fact, that the intelligence behind that, the sort of overarching motive and the really the mind molding, I would say providentially molding, in fact, in Caesar's view, this his own same exploit, and what was evidently accomplished anyway. It's not like Caesar invented to have conquered Gaul. So you have to explain in that way, if you have any problem with that, how that would have been possible. Also knowing very well, by the way, the Roman manpower shortages in Gaul because of the constant control that the Senate exercised on Caesar's pools of recruitment, that they did not want to rise a more than match, well, you can fully appreciate one of the greatest works in the entire history of mankind. The reason why we discuss this today is twofold. From one side, I would say this is the introductory aspect that I like to push forward to immediately say what where we are talking from here, right? In general, right? From a moral, scientific, and cultural point of view. And to make a point, in fact, in this sense, like this work has a meaning that travalicates whatever you're habituated to read on average on the internet, wherever you may hear this from. And that is also well known, historiographically speaking. So just for highlighting the radical divergence between common people, so to say, and I'm being kind here, and actual cultural elite scholarship that does exist and is inherently superior, regardless of their faults, to evidently the masses that have never gotten anywhere, for that matter, in that regard, by definition. The other point is understanding the deep display of massive strategic erudition and intelligence that Caesar made with this work, right? Because there is, again, a specific military assessment made through the Commentarii De Bello Gallico that revolve fundamentally around counterinsurgency warfare, right? The Commentarii De Bello Gallico are, just per se, if you want to also appreciate the essence of Celtic warfare in that regard, essentially the perspective of a superior civilization that is dealing with essentially underdeveloped peoples and has to take over this immense space, because Gaul was enormous and very populated and fairly rich, as a matter of fact, as we well know from the Oppida, from the road systems, etc. That illustrates this asymmetry, illustrates the difference between the two cultures, and that just per se, like if you have missed in the reading of the De Bello Gallico, it's like, you know, the biggest elephant in the room, because there are multiple pachyderms in here to unpack. Now, further premise, because the latter aspect is relevant. Now, why is counterinsurgency warfare important? Well, for many reasons, just self-explanatory, but in ways that are functional to our channel's art of war teaching. So counterinsurgency, and say insurgency warfare in general, also known as guerrilla warfare, describes essentially the efforts of, you could say, irregular troops battling an enemy army that adheres to so-called conventional combat methods, or in fact regular combat methods. There is no doubt that the line between the two can be blurred, right? When we look at the Romans and the Gauls, we're not looking at overwhelmingly different peoples in the scale of, for example, contemporary military standards. They were all pretty similar. They were sedentary European populations, essentially coming from a warlike background, regardless of how this had both in Italy and in Gaul shrunk to just a specific part of the population, especially in the Roman case, towards a professional, fully standing professional army that are fundamentally based on heavy infantry, not too much cavalry. Also, the Gauls really had a veritable passion for cavalry. They had especially a lot of it. It wasn't actually that good. That's the other myth that I always point out. I not just made lots of references to this in all my Celtic warfare, ancient Celtic warfare videos, but I also made a video about the very underrated quality of the actually very good Roman cavalry that is the victim of this internet chit-chat pseudo history that would like to see the Romans as some kind of weakling, Mediterranean inferior race that fought against these brave blonde-haired giants that, were simply should have, exterminated tens of thousands of Romans at a time, every time before being taken down for some reason. Again, this is not really what would happen. We could digress on that too, which is something we could surely make at some point. But first of all, the Romans had some military standards, and even just in terms of height selection, it's likely in the sense that the Roman legionaries at large were even taller on average than their average Celtic peasant levy counterpart, right? And even also other more elite troops, right? The Gauls and Italics were not that different at all, right? Everybody knows from ethnolinguistics that aside from the strong proximities, Latin and Gallic were almost like the same language. The second Roman declension is identical to the Gallic one, so fundamentally, we're talking about peoples that very much spoke the same language. Think about Rix or Rex, right, or the same root word. Especially the military root words were pretty close. Like the contact between Gaul and Italy had always been very strong. The same Gauls, as you know, had been in part allied to the Romans in Gaul, right? Think about the Aedu. We also made a video about them. The Romans at some point highlighted differences to prove essentially the moral superiority of their civilization. So indeed, if you want really to get into how, what Caesar says is relatively, embellished or masked, or is at least saying something that hides or simply does not take into consideration something else because it was not needed in this work, just know that the similarity between the two peoples was consistent, and that, however, the political and social development very divergent by that time. It's not even to say that the Gauls could not win the war against Caesar, right? Likely on the longer run they would have been taken over by Rome, but naturally, this is true for Caesar's person in particular, because of the Fortuna Caesaris, the entire theology that was built in, as you know, Roman history and literature on what Caesar accomplished through the same wars, also in other circumstances. Say Caesar's strategic thinking is crystal. All right, this guy was not even technically a military man just by vocation, but by need, right, by necessity. And yet he mastered this. This was one of the, many phases of the completion and the superiority of Roman civilization that we have highlighted in some videos dedicated to the Roman leadership, chain of command, officers' careers. The Roman elites had basically to perform military service as commanders of legions, and within the legions, before passing to a more, at least more, it doesn't make sense to distinguish civilian and military at this point more than much, because more or less all Roman magistracies, in fact, of some importance, were provided with the imperium, and just from a cultural point of view, it would be wrong, but essentially to become mostly like civilian administrators later on a bigger scale. I will not digress on this aspect either. Caesar's military curriculum, even before the Gallic Wars, is really impressive, also in terms of individual combat prowess, that really shows how Roman commanders were not simply some sort of, again, secularized, modernized civilians that did not know how to fight. It is true that probably like Vercingetorix Rix was a much more proficient warrior in individual terms, but even for the Gauls, telling the truth, we should a bit resize that sense of utmost warriorism and barbarism, because by this point, also one of the reasons why they were taken out is that although more developed, and so in normal civilizational terms more ahead than other warrior cultures, like, for example, they were superior to the Britons, but inferior to the Germans. typically because the Germans were more compact, more cohesive, more pressured as well. They were more primitive, less developed, but the Celts had developed essentially a quasi-feudal system where most of the people were not that involved into, say, warrioristic lifestyle like the Celts of the previous centuries before the great migrations and their settlements. And in fact, also the elites were surely very, very loaded, very, very trained, but in this sense would have had to display broader political capacities just beyond being a warrior that they would have been to some extent. So I will not talk about this topic either, because there is a difference again between Gaul and Britain that was much less advanced, but also less secular, we could say. It sounds strange to call, I don't know, the Gauls secular for the time being, but the Britons, as we were saying before, were actually so less military effective than the Gauls. They were the only Celtic people were champion warfare, let's say, heroic warfare, so to say, still persisted in a fashion. I also have a series incoming on the Roman conquest of Britain and the general military history of the Britons against Rome. In any case, the point we're making today is, again, consider this is the context. This is more or less like the divide between Rome and Gaul, right? It doesn't matter how advanced the Gauls were. It doesn't mean that you have to force hand by claiming that, no, they were as developed as the Romans because this and that. It's not history. It's pseudoscience. It's something that I've seen. I have even I own publications that from debatable publishing houses, by the way, that try literally to say like everything was a scam. The Romans are the evil guys of every situation because we're the best. Unfortunately, this is a thing that inexplicably went on, right? I don't know anything of this kind, again, from a Germanic side. It is incredibly weird, and I would like to warn people of the fact that, there are people who actually issued this stuff. So it's incredibly disturbing to begin with that there can't be literal people that vote, have children, drive cars, etc., that are capable of writing this stuff. In any case, guerrilla warfare, in his text, De Bello Gallico, Julius Caesar outlines methods to suppress uprisings that rely on pinprick strikes, right? Swift attacks followed by retreats, a tactic now seen across the globe. In fact, this is not much, especially with the war in Ukraine, the point anymore that basically is just super Western powers that can intimidate everything into subjection and at best occupying some places and having guerrilla going on as essentially what the future of warfare should be, right? This is not just even to cite Fukuyama, but the idea that everything should have stopped to just, there is no big war anymore, the world order is always going to remain the same just because against any moral or scientific evidence. It's not even to say that would be a bad thing. We would have liked that to happen for that matter, and more or less we're still there. It's not like things have radically changed regardless of the evidently incredibly ineffective level of Russian propaganda that we are continuously bombarded through, because at that point we should have simply flipped everything already. And we well know why that happens if we have studied military history. And this is unsurprising, but ineffective propaganda is the product of an inferior culture. So now everybody's a general who knows everything about drones, about the changing of the world order, the beginning of a multipolar world because of geopolitics. This is what lesser people are. Up to a few years ago, Instead, the entire point was about asymmetric warfare. Like this sense that, there are some guys who fought like that, and instead these others fought like that, and this is not like real warfare, this is a different type of war. This is also what lesser people said. And unfortunately so, when you realize that these terms gain recognition among the wider public, you know that not just the wider public is, of course, the lesser people, but that, of course, these are idiocies at large. In fact, newspapers, TV broadcasts, and online platforms, all the main receptacles of lesser people's attention, provided up to a few years ago at least, the concept of asymmetric warfare is the key feature of contemporary conflicts, by the way, because saying conflict instead than war, even though they actually mean two radically different things, especially in a Clausewitzian sense, is the other lesser people's phraseology, is often highlighted, in fact, as the concept of asymmetry embodied, so to make a long story short, by a nation, typically a major power, equipped with highly trained regular forces using cutting-edge technology, especially because technology must be the bigger deal there, vast economic and population resources. If again it was, warfare was just a matter of deterministic, materialistic issues, just how big a country is, or how many people live there, or how much money they have, or how much technology they have, as if military history hadn't proven over and over and over again that it's moral forces, it's politics that actually makes the thing, and it's a radically different dynamic that has to do with the cultural quality of a people, where, as we know pretty well, there is anything in the world today that can be barely called a culture, or even people for that matter. So that is not to say not identified without significant and diplomatic sway, but it's something, basically just like as if there were other tools in addition to, right, war, as if, again, war wasn't actually a continuation of politics with other means, or diplomacy was something different from politics, or, as if strategic dynamics as we see today could simply be altered by, let's wishfully think that now the war must end, even though, you don't even offer a reason why that should be the case, or at least you're simply doing that without leveraging force, which, against those who are waging the war themselves. So, complete cultural illiteracy at levels that objectively we had not seen in the last. I mean, in the past, like, people were normally more, more capable of just staying in line, right? Instead, with moral laxity, everything becomes, I don't even understand what I'm hearing from the news. I will just try to further alienate from reality by wishing that one side was doing something that is the opposite of what was actually happening, and thinking that making X posts about that will actually change the world, right? This powers from one side, bigger powers from one side, and pitted against makeshift and frequently under-equipped local groups. So things like rebel militias, terrorist organizations, guerrilla units, often blended together in a complex and ever-shifting tangle. This is a very wrong conceptualization. In fact, certain bogus scholars have argued that this situation marks a distinct and unprecedented shift in history that, as we've seen, just if this was the... First of all, they always happen. I mean, if you read the actual De Bello Gallico, it's literally what you're reading, and it's just how many wars are have always been fought like this. The majority, you could argue. But no, of course, it's like the people who said that there was a military revolution, and so that we have to pretend that this asymmetric warfare was unprecedented in history, suggesting it has overtaken the state-to-state wars. Oh my God, of earlier eras in our modern ages. These are like, the post-Westphalian and the pre-Westphalian world system and state and all this. But, like, there are actual people, like living human beings that actually say these things. Beware of them. Conversely, people just provided with common sense, and fortunately also other scholars, challenge the uniqueness of the concept of, the uniqueness of asymmetry per se. In fact, pointing out that all wars are inherently uneven, right? Putting the enemy in a condition of inferiority is the purpose of any war, right? No two sides have ever been perfectly matched. This dynamic changes, right? There are laws of reciprocity. There is the offensive and the defensive. There is the culmination of the attack. There are so many different. There is some suspensions of the actual major efforts during campaigns. So wars can always be distilled to the interplay between aggressor and defender, without recurring to the notion that there are some wars that are sort of asymmetrical and others are symmetrical. This is just pure moral relativism. It belongs to the lesser of our system that fortunately are at the bottom of it. And so it is fundamentally the expression of an inferior culture and of a fundamental and deeply rooted illiteracy that has nothing to do with the art of war, with strategic culture, with military history. It mostly belongs to those sort of so-called centers of geopolitical studies or whatever. So it's basically wasted money for squeezing, the purses of other lesser people that have stopped understanding what to do with money, and that do not really bring anything new to any level of moral or scientific analysis of warfare. Now, Roman legions dispatched far from the capital to quell defiant populations. Without questions, wars between nations, in spite of all, have grown less frequent today. We know why. Eclipsed in both significance and intensity by these so-called, I refuse to term them asymmetric struggles. This is not to say it can't happen, right? But again, empires like Rome's that were simply able to cross an entire continent to go conquer another people and routinely do so against other nations is practically not there, right? And even when it happens, it usually ends in disaster. So we're indeed living in a time in which things are differently calibrated, because history does vary, but it's not like the nature of warfare that varies. It's the way this declines in reality that does, and it's a radically different thing. As we were saying, of course, from a historical standpoint, it's equally clear that examples of battles between the dominant powers' military and assorted irregular fighters are plentiful, even before the idea of a state. In fact, when we look at Rome, we're not really looking at a state, at least in a modern or a contemporary sense. It was a state, but you can argue that there was some sort of state also in the Celtic world by some degree. So even here we should understand what kind of difference was there inherently, categorically, between the two contendants. Doesn't really matter too much, right? There are some important distinctions across history, but also in specific times in history, wars, especially those that are actually fought in a meaningful way, because also guerrilla is the expression of, it's a strong form of war, but it's the expression of strategic inferiority. If you can't fight in what you would call, in the sense, a conventional way on the same ground, it means simply that you cannot assemble your forces in open ground to meet your rivals on the same footing, except, risking to just being wiped out. And this is basically what happened also during the Gallic Wars and in other similar clashes. Now, even before the idea of a state modernly meant and its legal framework was fully formed, every imperial authority faced armed resistance in its past, but sometimes spontaneous, sometimes hastily organized, willing to employ whatever tools were at hand to thwart its expansionist goals. Rome, the inaugural grand empire of European history, offers numerous instances of asymmetric campaigns against rebels led by guerrilla commanders of remarkable martial prowess, by the way. This is obvious considering that Rome was the dominant power for a very long time over a very vast expanse of land populated by peoples, by foreign peoples, right? Rome did not annihilate nations in a endemic sense. There were enormous slaughters. There was a level of Romanization and a general decline of other people's cultures and all this, but Rome fundamentally saw her subjects as separated peoples as much as they felt that, even when they were okay with being under Rome. And again, I made some videos about individual Celtic and even Gallic peoples, and you can see there how this was also just to a degree normal. You don't just say, okay, well, whoever is invading me or whoever is absorbing me in some way, I will simply fight against. Historically speaking, this can happen in so many different ways. And even though, because normally of the political fragmentation typical of these tribal peoples, this would bring, in fact, to a lot of friction in the form of guerrilla. In fact, this, could not and would not be any major struggle, or at least it would rarely be, to the point that Gaul makes, in fact, a great example, because it was essentially a tribal system, but it was also so big and so relatively well enucleated in some cultural and geographical sense that it was possible to witness, first of all, the weakness of the system that had been already proven since the times of the Cambrian migrations. It simply crossed Gaul and showing everybody basically it was open. But also the capacity of the Gauls at the latest moment to put together substantial amount of forces to even defeat Caesar at a point. Think about the siege of Gergovia, but ultimately losing Athalesia and for good, basically. Yes, there were other, the war wasn't completely over. There were some other tribes to tame. There would be rebellions later on, but as we know, Gaul is one of the most magnificent examples of the success of Romanization in a civilizational sense. Gaul would go on to be, in fact, still one of the single most advanced countries in the history of mankind since Roman times, late antiquity, migration era and beyond, thanks to Romanization. And the immense legacy that Rome left in this country was recognized also in recent times by French presidents that, of course, speak also from, a rhetoric. It could be quite civilly influenced by the citizenry ideal of the French Revolution later on that was inspired to Rome, as you know, to an extent. But it's also historically undeniable under basically every point of view, showing that definitely, on the very long term, certain cultural meetings are productive, that when different elements of civilization are combined and there is a specific tandem between the two, like some of the greatest peoples can be born. Think about the Saxons after the Carolingian conquest, literally emerged to probably to be Roman emperors themselves. So there is also a full subscription to that older model, to the point of wanting to even top it after having previously fought it. So this is incredibly important. But speaking of also different leaders that oppose themselves to Rome, they were very often popularized in a nationalistic sense in later centuries for different reasons. We cannot deny that there was a force within under the same Roman dominion that was capable of brewing and exploding at times with some very damaging and grueling wars, extending, spanning almost 2.5 centuries, from the 3rd century BC to the 1st AD. For example, to subdue the Iberian Peninsula, where the Roman Quintus Sertorius, an adversary of Sulla, stood out, or the Roman-Jewish wars, which embroiled Rome in decades-long clashes from 66 to 136 AD, with figures like Shimon bar Kokhba, ending only with the ruin of the Temple of Jerusalem and the scattering of the Israelites. I just made a mini-series about the First Jewish-Roman War and Bar Kokhba's rebellion as a starter for further content on that topic. We have seen there almost, you can say, a war lost in its inception, but one where the Jews were deeply disorganized, right, exposed to the greatest power out there, that nevertheless had to resolve, and the audacity to fight and die and to risk. This was the Jews were really the only people who risked a genocidal disappearance from history during the wars against the rebellions against Rome. If it hadn't been for other Jews that sided with Rome, and that also in this sense do not prove ipso facto that was not genocidal intent from Rome's side, that follow in fact the traditional sense of imperial Catholic power that could not contemplate a simple extermination. In fact, this is also something that we will understand with Caesar, the notion that Caesar was just out there exterminating Gauls. This is also very infantile and brutally ignorant misunderstanding or complete rejection of any read of the Commentarii De Bello Gallico. If you have read that, you know perfectly well that just in principle you should know from Roman history that there weren't such intents per se, but that, again, this, aside from the whining, we were genocided, this bullshit that people like to say all the time, look at the Palestinians today, the sense is that Caesar recurred to violence. Some people will laugh at this, and that's surely a cultural problem, a subcultural problem. But Caesar used violence the least possible, right? See, if you, especially the offender, in any given, what we know it from clauses, does not actually have an interest in protracting warfare more than much, unless he is particularly desperate for some reason, which does not suggest any strength, because, you know, if that goes long, it means that you're not winning and you have lost the initial advantage that as the superior party you would have since the beginning. And with the Commentarii De Bello Gallico, you have a perfect picture of how proper strategic practice is supposed to unfold. Rome's ability to seize and hold her empire for centuries rested on leaders even more adept and proficient at neutralizing such rebellious threats, which were as perilous as they were unorthodox. We shouldn't forget that they had a chance, right? And no war is fought until the sides goes on for some reason, right? Remember always von Clausewitz that says that the truly decisive battle is the last, right? People believe that, you know, that there is this peak moment, from this moment onwards the war was lost or was won. This does not make sense on the grounds of war as an instrument of politics, right? Because there is the world out there, right? There is not just that war. And this is what people should be should get habituated to in strategic analysis. You know, they do. I mean, strategic analysts at least understand in a broader sense these things, but there is a desperate necessity of determinism, either for partisan reasons or just because objectively, like, you can even predict that one power, doesn't matter how strong it is not committed enough or is not simply able to envision, for example, a strategic goal, especially because of, and as usually, as for the lack of a broader political one, right? And that's where desperation, as I was saying before, also stems from. It actually pushes wars further because of all the backlash, of course, of a failure. Indeed, the Roman legions boasted the finest leaders in counterinsurgency warfare, with the most exceptional being Gaius Julius Caesar. This is the reason why we're actually talking this, because, again, this was a tough series of wars that, again, were pressuring Caesar in a particular sense at home. He had started this war for a specifically instrumental political objective that was, of course, rising to power in Rome. For him, Gaul or Dacia would have been the same. Had he gotten the proconsulate of Illyricum, he would have taken over Dacia, right? Mostly for the very precious mineral resources of that land. But he ended up in Gaul. Just imagine this also from a cultural perspective, right? You are a major leader of the hegemonic, ecumenic, the naturally ecumenic empire that manages unprecedented amount of wealth and power at the head of a military instrument has been professionally molded in centuries of successful military expansion and a lot of counterinsurgency warfare already, for that matter. And you can't just visualize which major people, nation, as a universe on its own, you can't want to take over. And it's an immense, titanic challenge just per se. This tells you just of what kind of mold these leaders were made, right? Caesar, pairing this with an extraordinary intelligence, sensitivity, expressional capacity, right? Caesar's prose is one of the most beautiful in Latin, also when relatively simple, for the ultimate end of showing the people of Rome what conquering a people like the Gauls actually meant. Here I'm simplifying. First, it would be the Belgians, according to Caesar, like the interpretation of Gaul itself, but in fact he calls it unitarily, by approximation himself in that way. Now, it was Julius Caesar who, through his De Bello Gallico, bequeathed to us this remarkable guide to counterinsurgency warfare. Strategy, tactics included, right? The earliest of its kind in military history, complete with detailed directives for conducting such operations, composed between the same wars, like 58 and 50 BC. The De Bello Gallico, likely originally titled Caius Iulii Caesaris Commentarii Rerum Gestarum, right, served as a collection of dispatches to the Roman Senate about his management of the Gallic War. Spanning 8 volumes, the final one penned not by Caesar but by an associate, it chronicles the military events from 58 to 49 BC with precision, written in a terse, detached style and referring to himself in the third person. Caesar shows keen interest in the habits and traditions of the peoples, the traits of their communities, the landscape's contours. We have often cited Caesar, as everybody must do, like in ethnographic works also about Celto-Germanic warfare. Also this insanity of saying, oh, but that guy wrote about the thing, about these peoples. It's not, you should be lighting a candle every single day to Caesar, to Tacitus. Doesn't matter what they said, for reasons they should be able to understand, and not flattering particularly the peoples they were even describing, because without them you wouldn't know shit about them, right? So you should be thankful enough and acculturated enough to realize that if you have any dignity as a human being, let's not even talk if you are can even deem to call yourself a European in a true elite sense, it is due to these people, right? Your entire life should be spent measuring how lesser of a human being you are compared to a Caesar or to a Tacitus, even just from an intellective point of view, from a literary point of view. You're simply not capable of even thinking what these people did, let alone doing what they actually did from a military point of view. A masterful strategist, this eminent Roman leader, offers abundant political counsel to his compatriots and the Senate, foreseeing an imperial future that embraces the subjugated nations, a vision realized under his adopted son, Octavian Augustus, the first emperor. If you do not know how this connects with the Indo-European Evangelion and the fulfillment of the reaffirmation of the golden age between the last, the third, and fourth in traditional prophecy, watch that video about the Fortuna Kaiser. Is because, again, if you have never even heard that existed, that's yet another gigantic problem. Julius Caesar was a statesman who turned to warfare, right? A politician led to war, we could say. And his military choices were never, this is incredibly important to understand, never fueled by needless cruelty, right? Literally, like the average person's supposed moral system, so to call it by conventional standards, by asymmetrical standards, let's use it in these terms, is I kill someone, I decide whether that's bad or good just based on whether I like that person, not knowing anything about the context. So in other words, if you just have some beef with Romans for some ethno-narcissistic complex of inferiority, the point is that Caesar was a monster, was an egomaniac, was some sort of, I don't know, terrible dictator. And by the way, every person that he killed was obviously some, good person, or at least they belonged to another world, and the terrible Rome was evil, and Romanization, of course, never brought any benefit to anyone or anybody, was not driven by the purest Indo-European traditional doctrine, and simply, according to which, by the way, should have failed according to these standards, instead succeeded in literally taking over these peoples and elevating to the same humanity for good with immense civilizational legacy bestowed on them. But who cares about studying Indo-Europeistics, right? It's just, it's a meme. If you're born in the 20th century, you're just a moron who thinks that, it's just something out there you can use and oppose to Christianity because of how you feel in the morning. That's literally how it gets down to. Now, instead, Caesar's military policies reflected a calculated use of minimal force to secure political ends. This is purest Clausewitzian culture at its best, even pausing military action to pave the way for diplomacy whenever possible. And again, study the work. We will see this in depth. Caesar argues that robust political leadership, willing to embrace substantial risk, is essential. Chief among them, the bold move of foregoing military might unilaterally to capitalize on chances to redirect war into peaceful channels. Yet, in the De Bello Gallico, he also warns of the pitfalls of negotiating with an armed foe in an asymmetric war. Attempting talks with insurgents already geared for battle and thus holding leverage might embolden more impromptu revolts, invalidate them, risking an uncontrollable spiral. Engaging insurgents in diplomatic talks proves effective only when it fragments their ranks and isolates the most formidable opponents. Otherwise, you have to hit, and to hit hard as they have never seen before. This is really the best strategy you could and should always use, right? For Clausewitz, it's clear. The best strategy is to be very strong. Literally, he says that. But what does this turn like into practice? Well, if you're coping with terrorism, so to say, for example, what Israel is doing has been excellent. You kill one of my people, I kill 100 of yours. And just without even caring, right? This is how it should be, how it must be. Because, as a matter of fact, this is the way to cause less deaths in absolute terms. This is also what von Clausewitz says at the very beginning of the Volkskrieg, as an intro to it. Says, whoever thinks, all those humanitarian spirits that think that war is, to be ended just with mild means and to kill a bit less, whatever, is a fool, because it's actually causing a lot more of unnecessary deaths. The best way to end war is to kill the enemy in a scale in immediate fashion that he has never seen before, right? That's what you have when you knock somebody down. It's not like you're just poking the person, you're breaking the neck. That's how it goes, right? It's not really negotiable, right? That's also why there is properly a moment, also legally defined, where, lethal force is green-lighted, right? And at that point, you must deliver that, as a matter of fact, to defend your life. The aim is thus peace achieved through war. This tenet, rooted in Roman custom, this was Rome. These were, as we've seen, people who had been fighting without rest for hundreds of years consecutively. That's how the Romano-Italic Confederacy had been established, right? These were the Roman legionaries from their warlike, in this sense, disciplined now Italic background. And in their vision of the world is simply as a system to remold metaphysically into God's unity through holy war, right? This is what they deeply believed, right? And this tenet was one of Caesar's adeptly applied from the outset of the Gallic Wars in 58 BC, when he encountered, for example, the Helvetii, who had migrated in droves from their lands to overrun Roman protectorates in southern Gaul and settling likely on the Atlantic coast. When they rejected his demand to disarm and retreat to their origins, Caesar met them in combat and prevailed, establishing a pattern that persisted through the following years of war. Extend an offer of peace first, then turn battle if refused. This is particularly important because the Roman modus operandi had always proceeded this way. If you look at the devotio, for example, the one of the deities of one side to pass to the Roman one to be preserved against the threat of annihilation and destruction. So literally the cancelling of a part of divine power against one that would have proven to be stronger ipso facto. And so this connects with this polyopium, etc., reflects this, okay, we offered you the lawful solution to it. We offered you a solution without blood, one that does not have to sacrifice life, that does not have to sin in this sense. Because it was seen like that ideally, where you shouldn't shed blood. This would be maintained in the Middle Ages through Christian sacramentaries for the knights, whoever killed in battle. That's not the way. But since we are fallen, right, we know that if there is no consensus, if in a sense from our side there is a failure to convince, there is no other way. If you are, the wrong to begin with, but we're also not perfect enough, we'll augment it ourselves by taking you over, as you refuse to do so willfully. By the way, at this point, Caesar had just offered the Helvetii just to come back where they historically had been stationing. So it was even just the most obvious behavior, considering that many other Gallic tribes were freaking out because of the Helvetii move. Also, by the way, because the Helvetii, together with the Belgians, were actually the strongest of not just the Gallic, but of the entire Celtic peoples, right? Belgians and Helvetii were really the toughest, the most nationally cohesive of the Celts, right? You know, that these were essentially also Celto-Germanic people, and they had toughened up against the Germans, but mostly, again, they were more politically cohesive. Organized, not even necessarily more developed than, for example, the Central Gauls, etc. But Caesar's display against the Helvetii, that is one of also logistics of Roman technical superiority that is often boasted, in fact, to make up for the Roman manpower shortages against this enormity of Gauls that surrounded them before, in fact, the Romans could come back to their main bases in Gallia Cisalpina, were the strongest people in Gaul. And so when the Romans defeated them, it was showed that Rome had the capacity to take over any other people, right? The same would be for the Belgians that also put up remarkable defense. And ultimately, the other Gauls were not capable, even under Vercingetorix Rex, in spite of their numbers, but they surely were consistent to successfully coalesce against Rome. And for a few, really, because Caesar risked very much in Gergovia, in Alesia, and there is there always the Fortuna Kaiser, is always the second element of the Clausewitzian Trinity. Gamble. That's what the military is about. Without risk, there is no reward, right? And so you had to fight. You had to roll the dice. Hence, alea jacta est, by the way, in another context of Caesar's life. But something that highlights his calculating, gaming, playing gambler mentality that must be pursued, not following the safest choice, but the correct one, the right one. And that is very often, in fact, the riskiest one, but the one with a greater reward if you were, of course, able to identify it through intellect, etc. So it's never only about courage. It is about rationale, about a series of considerations, because games are a serious thing. And as von Clausewitz tells us, war is a game both objectively and subjectively, right? Now, the central tenet shaping Caesar's approach is the belief that, in fact, in a war against insurgents, the main obstacle isn't simply vanquishing enemy forces on the battlefield, but rather maneuvering them into a pivotal moment, a pact with terms that secure peaceful coexistence. Rebel groups, indeed, adopt a slippery, prolonged tactic of wearing down their foes through a gradual drain. That's why guerrilla is a strong form of war, because it's a heavily attritional one, which erodes the spirit of troops in the field and saps support from the populace at home. The Vietnam War is a great example of this, and it's not even just guerrilla. In fact, it shows how attrition is just part of the game for that matter. One key method in counterinsurgency warfare involves deploying diverse lures to capture the rebels' focus and provoke a response. For instance, a fort that seems lightly guarded might trick insurgents to believing they could overrun it, right? Whoever has read the Commentarii knows what passage that is, only for Caesar to capitalize on his tactical agility to launch a counterstrike. Right, you literally obliged, because warfare was really that religiously bound. We've seen it before. Asking for a peaceful settlement of the matter was quite importantly a moment of truth, right? Who was capable of imposing their own authority, and if the other refused this, like they were to prove their own strength in combat, and that at that point became a trial in front of God, and the settlement was truly inappealable. In fact, with Rome, the case was that yes, they would at times commit great destructions in the beginning, in the moment of the conquest, and depending on different other issues. In fact, at other times, and actually most of the times, the point was, okay, I defeat you in fair and square in a so to say conventional clash. So there is a climatic battle. I annihilate your military. In that, after that, your people has to swear obedience. They're subjects, right? We have conquered you, establishing a sacred rule over you, right? This has been wanted by God, and it's been achieved in holy combat, in fact. If you break that, if you do not accept this trial, of course, you can, in traditional terms, shake off your chains, but the ultimate outcome is going to be you wanted further war, you wanted to be further tested. Well, at that point, you cannot expect to be treated better than before. you broke an order that was part of the conditions of two powers meeting on a fair ground, determining who was best, in this sense promising not to basically attempt too much, because you were just trying to be superior in the eyes of God. If you weren't, and that was your entire people essentially, that's why the matter of leaders was crucial at times. Certain leaders, that was always the point, especially in this more politically fractal systems, that different war bands, different noblemen would not join against a certain foe, because they didn't think it was the right time to do so. They would just wait the right moment. And if an antagonistic leader had, from their own people, had done it in their stead, and they had not followed that, they thought that, after all, they had not been defeated. It was that leader with his followers that had been defeated, the others hadn't. So this could and would be seen as a form of weakness since the beginning, because this meant that the people was divided to begin with. And now, if, of course, like as it often happened with Rome, the rebels had already been a defeated people, and or had even more simply accepted Roman dominance without fighting, which put their rebellion at that point in a much worse place, because the Romans admired more those who fought at the beginning and just eventually were Romanized, than those who accepted to be subjected to Rome and then rebelling later, right? So luring the rebels, or at least offering them these chances of attacking scattered Roman forces, at some point were not there just as baits. Literally, Caesar did not have enough troops most of the times, yet he had to garrison an enormous territory like the Gallic one. So all of this fell under the a very tight mechanism of political and strategic locks that had to be, in fact, unlocked through warfare. And this is what the entire Commentarii De Bello Gallico, as you know, is practically about. It's this constant crushing of this and that rebellion to the end, of course, maintaining the broader control over the region. For example, laying siege to an enemy town or outpost was designed to draw in enemy reinforcements, in the same way creating the chance for a major confrontation with them. That was strategically obvious. Most battles in antiquity, not just in the Middle Ages, stemmed from an army come to break a siege, right, to bring relief to a surrounded community, and the enemy being strong enough to give battle in the same way in open field. But this was also a way to say, okay, I besiege this place. Now we will see who's actually looming in the shadows, ready to, or thinking that he would better attack us. So emerging, identifying himself as a foe who had broken that pact with Rome, because in theory here Rome was coming as a broader protector protectrix, let's say better, of Gaul, right? Here, as I said at the beginning of the video, we're given for granted that we know what's the context of this all, and some would say, but that was hypocritical from the Romans. Wasn't it hypocritical from anyone? Like, wasn't it hypocritical from the Germans to intervene? Because some Gauls had asked to intervene against Rome, and before that, some Gauls had asked Rome to intervene against other Gauls or against other Germans, and because, again, the Germans had already invaded Gaul and laid it waste before in the century, and Rome had already had to intervene in Gaul to put an end to that. So we're looking at, so what were the Gauls doing? Weren't they capable in all their supposed might to defend themselves by themselves? Obviously enough. That this would be enough to erase any sort of the Gauls could simply, again, unite and defeat everything and everyone here. Well, not quite in a broader moral and cultural sense, because otherwise they would have not found themselves in this situation to begin with, right? Now, in the toughest scenarios that would produce themselves, Caesar doesn't shy away from employing scorched earth, arguably the most despised and brutal military tactic due to its ruinous toll on local people. Here too, the Roman leaders' aim is not driven by any specific cruelty, but by cold, calculating logic, pushing the enemy into combat not just by cutting off their food supply, but also by forcing the impacted communities to rely on him for all their needs, without mentioning that, as you know, Vercingetorix Rex starts to do the same exact thing against Caesar after the Romans have won battle after battle. Caesar at that point has to advance not just with manpower shortage, but in this sense supply shortages across hostile territory, trying to take by storm the major Gallic oppida that were containing, in fact, important amount of resources, and so he had to risk getting bogged down in a siege, in a static position, offering some kind of initiative to the enemy in order to achieve that specific strategic and political objective. And so, you know how painful those pages really are, because the Gauls at that point start learning from the Romans how to operate. That's how Gergovia produces itself, by the way. Caesar also shows a keen understanding of the need to cut insurgents off from any outside support, right? Besieging them was a way, in a sense, to do that, or at least to get more Gauls as possible out there against him, to target them and to slaughter as many as possible, just to be more morally impacting on the enemy, but really risking more himself. The Gauls, for example, often turned to the Germanic tribes along their eastern frontiers for aid, receiving eager backing from these groups who were all too ready to cross the Rhine in pursuit of loot, territory, or merely a chance to brawl. We've seen what the Germanic Gefolgschaft historically consisted in. It was just a way to be always military fit in function of the relentless struggles forever ongoing among the Germanic tribes, reason for which they were, generally speaking, tougher than the Celts, but the latter had pretty much the same thing in the previous centuries. We've seen multiple instances of this, from the Fiannas to probably the earlier Iron Age Celtic war bands. We'll come back on that topic. It was to distinguish between warbander and sort of levy militia of some sort. That would be the majority, by the way, of the Gallic warriors. Here, it would be interesting from an anthropological point of view to try to differentiate a bit, which I usually do when I talk about especially Gallic tribes. We could say that, I don't know, the Belgians or the Helvetians, as we said, were a bit more into that craft. And if you move, it's complicated to simply separate even just the Germans from the Celts, but there is a trajectory you can follow. And there were, for example, populations like the Lugi that at some point could devote themselves entirely as war banders, as an entire people in arms. So this is technically what the Romans still did in a conceptual sense with the Legio, with the brutal Roman training. It was sort of the same initiation with properly the belonging of the soldier to the tutelar deity under the leaders in the fully Indo-European fatherly hierarchical meaning, etc. So these were people who really cared about it. Gallic warbanders at this point consisted of the so-called solduri, which literally, as the name says, I was saying before, in the similarity between Latin and Gallic, refers to the soldiers, to the pay. The fact that these were professional soldiers, maintained in part by the greatest leaders, and in fact sustained by the work of lots of people that once may have probably been part of the war bands during the time of the Celtic migrations, but that now had long settled down, especially in the richer Gaul that had somewhat softened up. Also, if you look at Gallic art, you realize that there was a lot of Dionysian Chthonic elements within that culture. This is the case of the Western Celts. We tend to imagine them as very Apollonian. In many ways, they were always a dual thing, but also the latter seemed to prevail, also because this was the far west of Europe, and actually not too many Indo-Europeans, like in other places, had overtly concentrated. So they were very interesting telluric cults from the previous years that had blended in. Think about the importance of female elements in the Morrigan, in the Gaelic mythology, etc. So we'll come to talk about them. And speaking, in fact, of the British Isles, Caesar was wary of the sway held by Britain's Druids. Very interesting figures. We never really made a video about the Druids, and there were the Romans understood them in more Hellenized literary terms, like Caesar described them like as experts in natural philosophy. In many ways, they were actually depositories of ancient knowledge. The equivalent of the Roman equivalent of the Druids were the Arvales, for example. It was a shared Indo-Europe. You see how the Druids, what we say at the beginning of the video, were weaponized in a sort of hippie, sort of anti-authority, anti-order sense. The Romans were evil. They killed, they persecuted the Druids. They had the same thing themselves, right? What they were persecuting was an insurgency, again, of a people that, in that sense, were not just contravening some laws that surely Rome would have forced in her own ways, etc., but that were peripheral in the sense of, being countercultural compared to the higher rule, right? And being actually as relatively dark, at least in this broader Celtic fringe, that really did have a lot of the Chthonic elements to that. Now, the Druids are a bit of a more complex figure here, because they should have been properly associated, as Caesar makes it clear, by the way, with the so-called secular elites. By the way, they were themselves part of it, telling you the truth. They were warriors themselves at some point. There was all an initiatic fashion, but the notion in this tendentially feudal society was to detach the masses from the ancient knowledge, reason for which the Druids, for example, were literate, but they wouldn't write down their wisdom, their knowledge. That was also all mixed with, again, natural science, astronomy / astrology, they differentiated, but also military training, broader religious tradition, etc. So a complex set of knowledge that wasn't, in fact, probably anything dramatically advanced in terms of there was a third millennium civilization was wiped out by the Romans when they took out the Druids. This is not really how it worked, also because some of this knowledge lived within the same Roman Gallo-Roman elites, right? Gallo-Roman establishment. So it surely was reabsorbed by a sense. But here we're talking about actual political and military infiltration. All right, there were war bands that really, let's say, the Druids, mostly with their ideology, sublimated revolt, and there was a contact between Gaul and Britain. Caesar had blamed the Druids for stoking Gallic defiance with their faith-driven rhetoric, and this worry drove him to bold measures to neutralize these risks. Notably, the uncertainty posed by the Britons prompted him to launch two audacious ventures in 55 and 54 BC, defying the Channel's perilous tides and risking the loss of his entire force traversing the narrow waters, which was a very concrete likelihood, by the way, or at least risk, that he decided to defy, because he realized that strategically, and in terms of political and strategical quantities, that it was impossible to tame Gaul had the Britons not been deterred, intimidated into what would essentially become a Roman subservience, because this is how the Britons literally became Roman clients until probably the Roman invasion in the first century, the conquest in first century AD. And it was actually a great success, right? People wonder why this happened also, for example, with the Germans, right? This was the same point: deterring, killing, destroying, showing Roman might and power, the fact that if they wanted, they could cross the channel, arrive there, ravage, beat the same locals on their own ground. And so proving that if Rome wanted, even if this seemed such a great risk, they could and would simply do it. And that this was essentially a divine enterprise, because the Romans took great pride in stating that Britain was so remote, right, at the edges of the world, that not even gods had ever set foot there, but the Romans did, right? In fact, in mythology, there is nobody talking about Britain, really, at least in the classical one, referring to the origins of the world, etc. So these incursions were incredibly effective and incredibly important, the same ones against the Germans. In fact, when facing both the Britons and the Germans, Caesar limited himself, yes, to scouting and power showing, but reaping tangible gains. Right? This is what people sometimes have literally difficulty to understand. Right? Once I even listened to this shouldn't happen, a modern history scholar that was apparently trying to be a military one, who said, I don't understand, like, that was about the Battle of Lepanto, by the way, saying, the Battle of Lepanto had no strategic results, consequences, because nobody conquered any land. So, if you're there, it's a problem, all right? Especially, and even more if you're supposed to be a historian, not just a military historical one, right? If you don't even understand that warfare is a matter of moral forces, and that, of course, after Lepanto, the Mediterranean never looked the same for the Ottomans, and this dictated, of course, their strategy, the future strategy and politics. You can't even understand why Caesar would launch incursions into Britain and Germany. Of course, not to stay, not to maintain control of these places, if not from the distance. If you don't even understand what establishing a client relation really means, it's difficult to understand politics and history other than just strategy and warfare. The Britons stayed out of Gallic matters. This is exactly what Caesar wanted to achieve, and he succeeded. And while his expeditions in 58 and 55 BC didn't stop German raids beyond the Rhine, they enabled him to enlist Germanic mercenary horsemen who shone brightly during the war's critical juncture in 52 BC against Vercingetorix, which, by the way, means the great leader of soldiers. And it should be pointed out that the Germans did not attempt any more incursions to the scale of Ariovistus, whose name, by the way, that could have also been expressed in Germanic like Ariovesuts, because, again, this Indo-European languages are basically all the same. Still, however, shows how the Germans, a bit as newcomers in Central Europe, because we're really descending from the north, were actually thinking highly of the Celts, the same they would destroy in the Boianum, for example. There was a florid civilization there in Bohemia, the Celt. I made a video about the Boy, by the way, explaining this imported precious minerals from Celtiberia. It was like the Germans arrived, everything collapses in this sense, and or at least it's heavily resized and shrank, but to a heavy degree, just also again for saying those that believed that the Germans and the Celts were so friendly against one another, just united against Rome. In fact, the Boii themselves in part relocated to Gaul, and peacefully during Caesar's times. So we want actually to appreciate their logistical capacity of tidally moving across Central Europe after those. Well, it wasn't just about the Germans; it was also about the Dacians, as we explained, but it was probably also mixed in different times. And so, like, Caesar really exterminated an incredible amount of people when he crossed the Rhine. That was heavy stuff, right? And so the Germans were actually deterred at large. Like, it's not like the Germans would attempt a major invasion of Gaul later on. anymore. So Rome had set the boundaries. By the way, Caesar was the first one to basically recognize that the Rhine was operationally the anchor were to install a monumentum rather than a limes, which is a term that the Romans did not really use, at least in order to define their military frontier. These would be consolidated by Augustus, and we talk about that as Caesar's legacy as well. Now, at the heart of Caesar's moral code was the dependability of his actions. He honored his word. This is also another radical Indo-European principle. If you ever hear a politician lie, and I'm here not making, of course, a populistic statement, I'm looking just at certain countries, especially post-Soviet world, which one where lying is the sole national identity because there is literally nothing else there. Just know that the Indo-Europeans believed that the Holy Ghost / the victory, the vainglory, would fly away if you said it even just one lie. Right? Xenophon makes it very clear that, an Achaemenid youth, for example, was trained to just fight, hunting, and just telling the truth. Remember what we said before about the Roman offer of peace initially. Caesar honored his word and stuck to two core pledges: mercilessness towards rebels and mercy toward those who yielded. Right? And this is an incredible civilizational principle. It's one that you literally see in Roman history all throughout, firmly connected with the concept of fides, that was true faith in that regard, in that revolved around military ethics and international relations. The lack of fides characterized the inferior cultures. And so being a rebel, as we said before, and because you had previously submitted to Rome, and then breaking that, it was just at that point, we will wipe you out of the face of the earth. Literally, right? When, the Romans, by the way, write about themselves, they made it a desert and call it peace, that all the, again, for some reason, the anti-Roman, they think they are right-wingers, but actually socialistic hippies say, oh, look at the Romans, we're terrible. It's a phrase that was written by the Romans to show how, by the way, this peoples did not understand what being an ecumenic power even meant, for how inferior they actually were. And this is, again, deterrence. This is what all great civilizations, what all superior cultures do. You try to cause trouble for any reason after being under us, because you decided this was formalized, you're officially into our control without any other form of independence or whatever, not wishful thinking like, you're another people that never had anything to do with us, or at least is now independent, and it was because we accepted this ourselves. No, really, we have given you enough to be just under us, with us. We have invested in your growth. We have co-opted your elites, whatever. You rebel, we will wipe you out of the face of the earth. Right, and especially because this is done through guerrilla means at the end of the day. Because if you really rule over us, you don't have an army on your own. You don't have a state on your own. So this is incredibly important to understand. This is not what lesser people believe, just to appropriate themselves of other countries with, in fact, lies that bring you to lose wars because of divine law. This is literally, you're trying to break order, like. Can be a criminal, can be anyone who perturbs public order. We're going to wipe you the hell out of the face of the earth. Right. Conversely, if you surrender, we show you mercy, which actually could be also we enslave you, whatever, if you had already rebelled. But we're actually always going to give you something. We're not going to exterminate you at that point, because you obeyed, because there was a point in all this in which you were doing the right thing. And so we will punish you, but we will continue, you will continue to live. And this could take all different degrees. The word, the foedera aequa and the foedera iniqua. We'll have to talk about this stuff in some other video. But this is how Rome had literally forged what was effectively a massive hierarchy of leadership and subjection. That was how all these traditional societies, by the way, looked like, the same Celtic one for that matter. And that is very, very well exemplified also in the Concordia Ordinum. I have a video incoming on this, on the corporative unity of the Roman people, for example, and all the peoples that the Romans ruled over, right? Caesar's leniency with the vanquished was strikingly rare, by the way, for the ancient era. Again, killing lots of people has per se nothing to do with anything. If you don't explain why it's happening, in which context, whatever it can be, war can be just genocide, can be whatever, can be this kind of guerrilla, an insurrection, it can be lots of things, all right? For Caesar's times, actually, this clean, cold, iron logic, accompanied by, from one side, deterrence, repression, from the other, mercy, leniency, is dramatically well calculated, rare, and fundamentally traditional because of what we just explained. Like, there is the foundational principle that if I let you live, I'm just not wasting the infinity of living potential, right? So I'm not committing the crime, the sin of just killing somebody when there was an option that did not really deem it necessary, right? If you pick up arms, you're fighting against me, I have to kill you. There's really no other way around that, right? And it's always wall against wall at that point, except if you surrender. At that point, that will be noted, right? And Rome is showing this. The Indo-European Evangelion is fundamentally based on this. It is a sum of which the same Christendom derives much of its nurture later on. It's probably all one with the Augustan era and the Caesarian legacy of that. It's parcere in Hermes, the Bellare Superbus in Virgil. Like it's the hymn to the Pax Romana, to Indo-European ecumenic world order. It's a motive of pride, right, of making of world Rome as a symbol of divine perfection. This is the same monastic principle existing in the Middle Ages, imitationally and with this kind of regulatory behavior of order. There, of course, things were split because church and state were separated, so it wasn't quite the same thing, but as we've seen also, monasteries were landlords, were under other lords, but this is for our medieval history lessons. Caesar offered pardons and favorable surrender conditions to those who gave in, fostering this choice among the wavering as well. This is very clever. Even the Helvetii, after their defeat, in fact, faced neither slaughter nor enslavement, but were merely directed back to their homelands. Right? This is the point. Beware those who break a Roman's faith. Protecting the safety of communities that accepted his rule was vital to Caesar. And he didn't flinch, as seen during Vercingetorix Rix uprising, from putting himself and his soldiers in serious peril just to uphold a promise, even to a minor tribe, right? Because if you did not maintain that, really the entire system would have crumbled. But so the Romans were not the master race. They're not God's chosen people. They do not really have the imperium. They promised that, right? And they owe it to us now because we are their subjects. This is an incredibly and deeply traditional behavior. This is what happened, say, I don't know, after the French defeat at Poitiers in 1356 against the English. The peasantry had served the French nobility historically, corporately, traditionally. Now, that imperium protection shield had collapsed, and so the system simply broke loose. Here Caesar could simply not do that, right? And equally important to Caesar was avoiding repeat battles with the same foes. Thus, those who surrendered were stripped of weapons, rendering them reliant on Roman protection. As we said before, again, if you rebel from this position, which is of course a disarmed one at large, you do not have any excuse. You can't get arms and armor. We've seen it in the videos about the Jewish wars. There was smuggling of the same Roman military equipment. There were ways to create weapons with the technology of the time with relative ease. And again, guerrilla is always nasty. It's always difficult to tame, right? This depends, of course, on how motivated the people is. After all, these wars do end at a certain point together with the rebellions, but literally because lots of people have been massacred by the Romans, right? That have also taken their losses, even though they're by far the superior military. And especially in this political situation of disarmament and subjection of these peoples. Of course, peoples that had, for example, were required to provide hostages, ensuring they posed no instant danger. So if you do anything, you're disarmed, and even if you manage to arm yourself in some way or you rise up, whatever, we have hostages. We have by the way, the ones of the establishment, so the children that were being Romanized in the meanwhile of the greater leaders, that would be very well kept by Rome, exactly to show the advantages connected with compliance to her. And this allowed Caesar to enact a sort of filtering of his opponents as well, an approach that bore early fruit when tackling fortified positions. His readiness to propose reasonable surrender terms greatly lessened the demand for expensive, drawn-out sieges, for example, right? This simply would bring to no major escalation. The Celts found out the hard way what the Roman polyurcetic military engineering capacities really were, right? There are many passages from the Commentarii De Bello Gallico that really show that. Think about the siege of Avaricum. There are many passages. The Celts are all sort of boorish about, being in their fortified placements, etc. And then they freeze because they start seeing the Romans building machine to storm their walls, and they basically start as they surrender, they also throw out all their weaponry that almost reaches the top of the oppidum walls, and inside the oppidum there is more of that. So there is even like okay, let's not fully escalate to, okay, we're going to be all exterminated. We will live on, also under Rome, right? The history of Romanization is very beautiful in its also generational perspective, because it really shows you how and why these people would comply at the same time, why in fact their limit was not really being able to resist to Rome in a political, strategical sense. So there isn't much to make morally or culturally about this point. Like the sense is that there are two civilizational scales, and here, of course, Rome has the upper hand. Yet this required tough play, right? Not just the Gauls were, like in this case, the Gauls, up to a fight, and again, also unreliable to an extent, fragmented, so you couldn't really say, even among all these factions, what was fully going on. They had secret conventicles. They would, at some point, organize themselves to carry out a major regional uprising. Yet, also, Caesar's threats were never hollow, right? It's not like the Romans were bluffing. Caesar was relentless with force. He did not shy away from that. No quarter was given to those who held out, and even less to those who, after submitting, renegade on their word and resumed fighting, especially the latter, right? Because the former, again, could also be understood, and their offspring being, also allowed to live with certain dignity, given that, after all, their men had really died as such. But again, if you were a rebel, if you were already subject to Rome, and this had been sanctioned by all the community, and that this rose up once again, yes, in traditional terms, it's a game. It's you can play, but at that point, it's the same image of Rome that is outraged to a degree that simply Roman superiority will not tolerate. Betraying Roman trust was unforgivable. Several Gallic tribes learned this the hard way, facing total annihilation, or seeing their councils held accountable for deceitful reversals put to mass execution. This is incredibly important, right? And it tells you why this was not genocide, because there wasn't fundamentally any other logic behind these massacres than mere political strategic balance, right? The Druids were not later on also in the further generations persecuted because they were, not even immediately, like it wasn't even just a way to simply enact that in a uniform, again, this is not a modern state or whatever, but because the threat was continuing in a terroristic sense. It wasn't some Roman whim to exterminate these people. After all, they had to rule over them. They had all to gain from their manpower and labor force as auxiliaries, as peasants. That's how the systems worked. The Romans co-opted them. They Romanized the leaders. This was it, right? It's incredibly important to appreciate, and even the extermination, the decapitation of an entire, not even decapitation was just for men, literally metaphorical decimation, so to say, of entire councils was literally beheading this tribe's leadership. The Romans didn't have anything against the Gauls per se. Notoriously, there were Gallic friends of Rome that stayed loyal to Caesar. There were Gauls in the Roman army at this point throughout all the campaign. Cicero and his brother had, strong relations, epistolary, but also, again, in the military with Druids, as we've seen. They were interested in them. This continued later on. Augustus talked with Druids. It was absolutely normal. There is no evidence whatsoever in Roman history that the Romans hated, say, the Gauls, other than portraying them as the stereotype, the standard barbarian, right, in the depths of their history. But again, having otherwise actually an admiration for that warlike culture, as they had for other subjected peoples that they had turned even into gladiatorial specialties, including, in fact, the Gaul, the Samnite, and so on. And there were peoples that had lived on under Rome, right? So if Rome had had any kind of vicious ideological hatred for whichever reason, they would have attempted, if anything, to kill everybody, or at least to kill with much more sadical bloodshed that we wouldn't even be able to historically explain. Caesar's work is crystal clear in the political and strategical logic that we can apply to the system as it is reconstructible. Because it's not like we have just Caesar telling us about what that society was. Politically, of course, like he's the major source on the events. But at large, the picture that is offered is perfectly coherent with what all we know about tribal cultures of that era, also from other slightly different times, because they hadn't changed very much, or they would continue like with that kind of level of development in ancient history and beyond. And it all makes sense. I mean, this is the history that you can find, I don't know, in China with steppes, tribes, or, it's pretty universal in concept. And the greatness of Caesar's works in this sense lays in the also strategic, military historical accuracy, all what we know also from von Clausewitz and any kind of study of the art of war, of how he actually handled them. We know that the Commentarii are reliable exactly because they describe an iron, logical, military picture that makes sense under every point of view. And to conceive justice in the complexity, but also the simplicity of such a work that is even just very pleasant to read and very picturesque and very insightful, is definitely just the proof of a great mind, a mind that could and had literally held on. There are some passages. Caesar was actually a sentimental person, telling you the truth. He knew how to control himself, but he was very, as we've seen, capable of very strong, firm decisions. But he was evidently a man moved by particular senses and feelings, and he beautifully highlights the contrast between the two things. Right? There are some passages, like, I don't know, when he receives the news of his daughter's death from Rome, he explicitly writes in this, again, detached way, because, as you know, it's always third person. Like, it's not like an overwhelmingly rich history about the individual person, but there are these anecdotes that he stays for an entire night and day in the tent, crying, essentially, because of such loss. And then he came out, and it was as if nothing had happened, right? A man that was able to accept what is not fate, because his relation with Fortuna, as we explained it in the relative video, was exactly the opposite of that. It was a sort of dance with Fortuna, mater et filia deorum. Because without that pursuit of the gamble, you couldn't propitiate Fortuna yourself. And so what Caesar does is actually escaping fate as a true Indo-European hero. This will be ever clearer during actually the Civil War, because at that point it's not about conquering these barbarians, it's about restoring the unity of the Respublica by coming out of it, right, with exceptional powers like the ones that Caesar acquires, and fixing it from a metaphysical standpoint. That's also why he basically redeems this Roman sin that, as you know, was at the basis, essentially, of the motivation. Why is God's chosen people fighting against each other, right? And the story was that the Sibylline book's content has been spilled, so there had been this mortal sin, and the Romans were destroying one another. Caesar saves the system and hands this in his self-sacrifice to Octavian Caesar. So that's actually the masterpiece, also of Octavian, that of course fostered this narrative further, but that was truly metaphysically understood. Like, also Caesar's political opponents were quite vocal about the fact there was something divine about him, Caesar included. Like, the Fortuna Kaiser stems exactly from that recognition. He's explicit about that. For example, in the crossing of the Channel that we remember before, he says to the helmsman, remember that you carry Caesar and the fortune of Caesar, which was literally a goddess. And not everybody's goddess, not a goddess like another. It was the same Fortuna, but in this sense, uniquely assisting Caesar. And so you see here how he is, and we could read it also in the Res Gestae from an Augustan perspective, of how the sense of the auspicia, right? We're just talking about this in the video about the Indo-European meaning of the patriciate, and so well fitting with the Roman nobility, that as Appius Claudius Caecus said about the auspicia themselves, in fact, auspicia sunt patrum, right? It means that the auspice is from God, so probably the gospel, the Evangelion, and so the Holy Ghost itself belongs to the fathers, to the Holy Fathers, because these are the ones who are actually operating between God and humanity to gap the system once again, to make the two natures recombine, eternally rising as the kings of the living, through a true immortality that, as you know, Caesar as a comet earned as the Divus Iulius. But this is yet another story. But remember that when you walk along the Imperial Fora, where you look at the spot where Caesar was assassinated, Largo di Torre Argentina, but also where you see the various statues of Caesar that exist. There's a tumulus when he was said he was buried, and so you see people bringing flowers. There is a reason what is the case. This is no superstition. This is no weird attitude. This is literally like the foundation of Western civilization in a pure metaphysical Indo-European sense. If you don't understand what the orbs is, what the Romans achieved, why Caesar is Caesar, it's for you just a history book story, essentially. You'll have, again, great difficulties to understand the world and reality. By the way, speaking of exterminated Gauls, just to make a grim example, such was the fate of the Eburones, who in 54 BC treacherously wiped out 15 Roman cohorts, roughly 6,000 men. This was a heavy blow for the Urbs, sparking one of, in fact, of the gravest crises of the Gallic War. After guaranteeing safe passage to their lands to the legionaries under legates Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, they sprang an ambush and butchered them. And it's painful to read because it literally, like, there is an open betrayal. I say, okay, we offer you open passage. This was against the Fides, right? It's not to say that the Romans were the only ones to have it, but being the inherently superior people, I made an entire video about the superiority of Roman civilization in an Indo-European lens. They were the ones who have not used this trick, and just an inferior culture could use this infamy. So actually here the problem why the Romans fall into an ambush is the Roman commanders. The Roman commanders had to be better of these lowly tricks. Instead, they fail. At least one fails. The others and is killed together with his soldiers. The other, in fact, comes back to the fort and resists against hope. This is the scene where Caesar sends a message with a messenger that shoots the literal envelope with an arrow that gets stuck under a tower or something, and then the Romans didn't read it as they were being besieged by the Celts, and the Romans arrived, proving, by the way, yet another crucial aspect, that is the centrality of leadership, of chain of command, of individual provosts, right? Every commander is given a decisional autonomy in the system, depending on the hierarchy corresponding to the expectations of these men, and those who fail succumb, right? So these Burones succeed in exploiting this guy's weakness, but do not wipe the Romans entirely out. This was also really typical. It happened also, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Basically, as soon as the Romans managed to install themselves in their forts, retreating, the barbarians, doesn't matter how much advantage they had out there, and again, ambushes are very asymmetric, just to come back to the original topic, because they really surprise the enemy if they succeed. I made an entire video about ambushes. They do, because the enemy is exceptionally unaware of that, which requires actually lots of skills. In fact, the Celts were good, etc. in this, but they were also because they couldn't really meet the Romans in open ground, right? In a way that would simply be, or they would, but it would be defeated more often than not. And in fact, the Roman operations in Gaul had already showed that. So that's why this was during an insurrection, during in fact, a pretty foggy situation that, imagine, even as provincial garrisons, it's very difficult to politically browse, right? And with reinforcements very far away. But here the Romans, again, show how dramatic their strategic and logistical capacities are. They have these blitz marches across Gaul. Imagine, even just regardless of the actual Celtic road system, that of course was nothing like the Roman one, aside from what, again, the fantasy lovers would like to make it be, but it also favored a lot the same Roman operations, right? So it's all part of this. This is an important aspect of also in Gallic and later French history and state building, and the way properly this region is articulated in terms of the main centers, the very fertile interland, the straight roads that also the Celts had in part established. The Romans would finally found in a proper sense, and really contribute to the establishment of a very neat and tidy system of governance, right? And so we know what happens to the Burones, that, yes, could get away with temporarily with this massacre of Romans, but that would actually suffer dearly for it. Caesar orchestrated their ruin with precision. Their forces were crushed, survivors hunted without respite, every settlement and home torched, cattle seized, crops and stores obliterated, leaving any who evaded capture to perish from hunger, right? And this is, again, if you think about it, deterrence is exactly there for it. Everybody who thinks that you can deter people by just flattering them, they're the weakest, right? There are ways to, of course, hope, as we've seen, that the other person may say, okay, well, I was wrong, sorry, but there is a chance to fix this in more peaceful terms. That would be ideal. But when there isn't, deterrence in ways that really, when you have the upper hand, are really also easy to use and really have a very strong effect in the equation, should and must be used. If anything, if you really care about the actual outcome of the war, and showing weakness, lack of objectives, like you may even hide that to your enemy, but in general, like having no idea, just living in the moment, it's not really strength, it's just weakness, it's existential uselessness, right? So that's something you really want to consider in a broader political sense. We must come to these topics because they're mostly the sap of any strategic and political analysis of sort. And so talking more about strategy is a way to it. I've been doing it more frequently from sometimes, and this is partly it. This is essentially a very good example. I cannot stress enough how important, again, Caesar's work is, how much you can you must appreciate this. As a matter of fact, I am going to talk more about the Gallic Wars and other Caesar's exploit, other Celto-Roman warfare. We have gone relatively far with this stuff, not too many videos, especially in the more recent times, but again, I will be compensating for this. There are, as you understand here, there is much food for thought, right? All what could be appreciated from an episode of this kind, from a theme of this kind, is contained in the work itself. So I will not digress much on this either. I would just say that truly history is a serious thing. Like, if you don't take it as such, if you think that there is just, enough that you have already lost. Right? It can be even a lot of stuff, but fundamentally, the ultimate outcome is not going to be satisfactory. So it's going to be crystallized into something that you're increasingly detached from. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.